Hey guys, welcome back. Tonight we're going to be talking about something that is so profoundly a part of our daily lives, we never even think about it. We're going to talk about trash, garbage, waste, the incredible mountain of stuff we throw away every single day, but we're not going to talk about our trash. We're going to drift back in time to the medieval world and explore a reality so completely different from our own. It almost seems like science fiction. We're going to look at the incredible resilience and ingenuity people had when dealing with their leftovers. It's a story about a world without plastic, a world where almost nothing was ever truly thrown away because it couldn't be. And in understanding what they considered waste, we learn an incredible amount about who they were. As always, if you enjoy what I do here, a quiet little like or a subscribe is always deeply appreciated. It just helps this little corner of the internet reach other people who might need a calm voice and a bit of history to help them drift off. And I'm always curious. Let me know in the comments where you're listening from tonight. It's a wonderful thought to imagine us all, scattered across the globe in our own quiet rooms, all settling in together. Now though, it's time to do just that. Dim the lights if you haven't already. Settle back into your pillow. Maybe pull the blanket up just a little higher. Take a slow, deep breath and let it out. Let the day's concerns just dissolve. They can wait until morning. For now, there is only the sound of my voice and the strange, distant, and remarkably resourceful world of the past. Let's ease into our journey together. Chapter 1. The Ecology of Scarcity. Redefining waste in the medieval mind. Let's begin by performing a little thought experiment. I want you to picture your kitchen trash can right now. Just conjure up the image. What's in it? Probably some plastic packaging, maybe a cardboard box, some coffee grounds, an empty milk carton, that weird bit of lettuce that went slimy in the back of the fridge. It's a collection of things whose useful life has definitively ended, their purpose has been served, and now their destiny is the landfill. They have become, in a word, trash. Now let's try to perform that same experiment for a medieval peasant, say a farmer named Thomas in the year 1250. Let's picture his little one-room house. Where is his trash can? Well, the short answer is, he doesn't have one. And not just because they hadn't invented plastic liners yet. He doesn't have one because he doesn't have the single most important ingredient for creating trash as we know it, the concept of disposable. In our world, value is often tied to newness. We crave the pristine, the untouched, the thing fresh out of its packaging. The medieval world operated on the exact opposite principle. Value was tied to endurance, to longevity, to an object's potential for a second, third, or even 10th life. Their entire existence was governed by a force we barely comprehend anymore, a constant whispering companion in every single decision they made. That force was scarcity. Scarcity wasn't just an economic concept. It was the climate they lived in. It was the air they breathed. Every single object, from a wooden bowl to a leather shoe, represented a significant investment of either time, labor, or precious materials, often all three. To throw something away would be like us taking a handful of cash and just letting it blow away in the wind. It was an act of madness, so before we can even begin to talk about where the garbage went, we have to fundamentally redefine the word garbage. We have to step inside the medieval mind and see the world not as a collection of products, but as a collection of raw materials in various states of use. Let's start with the clothes on Thomas the farmer's back. He likely has one, maybe two sets of clothing. His main tunic is probably made of wool. This isn't the soft machine-loomed merino wool we might think of. This is coarse, scratchy, heavy wool, likely still smelling faintly of lanolin and the sheep it came from. The process of making this single tunic was monumental. The sheep had to be raised and sheared. The wool had to be cleaned, carded, and then spun into thread by his wife Eleanor, using a simple drop spindle. This task alone would have taken hundreds of hours, fitted in between cooking, cleaning, farming, and raising children. Then that thread had to be woven into cloth on a rudimentary loom, another painstaking, time-consuming process. Finally, the cloth was cut and stitched by hand into a tunic. This garment isn't a piece of fashion. It's a piece of critical survival equipment. It's a family heirloom in the making. When Thomas wears it, he wears months, if not years, of his family's labor. So what happens when he snags it on a branch and it tears? He doesn't sigh and toss it. Eleanor gets out her bone needle and some more homespun thread, and she mends it. The patch is a badge of honor, a testament to thrift. Over the years, the tunic acquires more patches. The elbows wear thin, they get patched. The hem frays, it's reinforced. The color fades from its original vegetable dye to a nondescript, earthy brownish grey. It becomes softer with 1,000 washings in harsh lye soap. When Thomas gets older, and perhaps a little smaller, or when the tunic is simply too patched to be respectable for him, it doesn't go into a donation bin. It begins its second life. It's handed down to his eldest son. The son wears it for several more years, adding his own layers of wear and tear, his own collection of patches over his mother's. The fabric gets thinner, more threadbare. Eventually it becomes too worn even for the son. Is it trash now? Of course not. Its journey is far from over. The most worn-out parts might be cut away, and the remaining goodish cloth could be repurposed into clothing for a much smaller child. Or, and this was incredibly common, the entire garment enters the next phase of its life cycle. It becomes rags. The word rag today has a purely negative connotation, but in the medieval world, a rag was a valuable commodity. A soft, absorbent piece of old linen or wool was the go-to for so many things. It was your bandage for a cut finger. It was your cleaning cloth. It was the sanitary napkin for the women of the house. Pieces of rags were used to caulk gaps in the wattle and daub walls of their hut, a desperate attempt to keep the whistling winter wind at bay. Scraps of cloth were stuffed into worn-out shoes to make them fit a little longer. They were twisted into wicks for rudimentary tallow lamps. If you had enough of them, they could be stitched together and stuffed with other, even less useful scraps of fabric and straw to create a thin mattress or a quilt, a precious layer of insulation against the cold. And even after all that, when a rag was so filthy and frayed that it could no longer even clean up a spill, it still wasn't necessarily at the end of its life. For the very, very few who were literate and had access to writing materials, rags, specifically linen rags, were the primary raw material for making paper. The rags were collected by a rag and bone man, taken to a mill, pounded into a pulp, and pressed into sheets of paper, a substance more valuable than many textiles. A piece of clothing could literally end its life by becoming a page in a Bible or a merchant's ledger. From sheep to scripture. That is the medieval life cycle of a single object. Try explaining fast fashion to someone with that mindset. Imagine telling them about a t-shirt you bought, wore twice, and then threw out because it was last season. They would stare at you with a kind of profound, uncomprehending horror. This philosophy of reuse extended to everything. Let's consider something harder, something more durable. Let's talk about metal. In a world without mass production and industrial mining, metal was astonishingly precious. A nail was a piece of treasure. If you were deconstructing an old shed or a fence, you would painstakingly extract every single nail, carefully straighten it, and save it for the next project. Dropping a nail in the dirt would prompt a frantic, minutes-long search on your hands and knees. So, what happened when a tool broke? Say a farmer's iron ploughshare strikes a rock and cracks. This isn't a disaster that sends you to the medieval equivalent of a hardware store. It's an errand. The farmer would take the heavy, broken piece of iron to the village blacksmith. The blacksmith was one of the most vital members of any community, a figure bordering on the magical. His forge was a place of elemental power. Fire, air, water, and earth. It was a place of transformation. He wouldn't just weld the crack. He would take that broken ploughshare, heat it in the glowing coals of his forge until it shone with the colour of the setting sun, and then, with the rhythmic, deafening clang of his hammer, he would reshape it. He would work the metal like clay, hammering out the impurities, reforming the edge. Maybe the ploughshare was too damaged to be saved. Fine, it's not trash. It's now a stockpile of raw material. The blacksmith could hammer it into 2 new horseshoes, or a set of sturdy hinges for a door, or a dozen of those precious nails. A fine sword, in a time of peace, could be reforged into a scythe. A broken scythe could be reforged into a set of kitchen knives. A chipped knife could be heated and hammered down into an awl for working leather. The metal was immortal. It just changed its shape. Its identity was fluid. It was never a ploughshare. It was a piece of iron currently shaped like a ploughshare. This is a world of potential, not of fixed identity. The idea of throwing metal away would be so alien as to be literally unthinkable. Archaeologists who excavate medieval sites are often disappointed by the lack of metal finds. It's not because they didn't have metal, It's because they never ever discarded it. Every scrap was recycled, reforged, and reused until it was literally worn away to nothing. This same logic applied to everything that came from the earth. Wood, for instance. A tree was a major resource. When a building was constructed, its massive timber frame was meant to last for centuries, and it often did, but if a building did fall into disuse, or was dismantled, those beams were not bulldozed. They were carefully extracted. A great beam from a lord's hall might become the central support for 3 peasant cottages. A timber that had started to rot at one end would be sawed down, the good part used for a fence post, the rotten part used for firewood. And what about the firewood? When it was burned, it left ash. Was the ash waste? Absolutely not. Wood ash, particularly from hardwoods, was a critical chemical component. It was collected and leached with water to create lye. Lye was then boiled with animal fat, another byproduct that was never wasted, to create a harsh caustic soap. It wasn't fragrant, and it would probably strip the skin from your hands, but it was soap, and it was essential for cleaning textiles, and occasionally, people. The ash that wasn't used for soap could be spread on the garden plots, as it contains potash and helps to sweeten acidic soil, improving the harvest. From a standing tree to a structural beam, to a fence post, to firewood, to soap, to fertilizer for the next crop. A perfect closed-loop system, driven by absolute necessity. There is no way to throw things to. There is only the next step in the cycle. Even broken pottery, something we would sweep up and throw out without a second thought, had a future. A shattered pot was a collection of shards, or potsherds. These shards were incredibly useful. Larger curved pieces could be used as scrapers for tanning hides, or as scoops for grain. And the smaller bits, they were collected, taken back to the potter, and ground into a powder called grog. This grog was then mixed into the new batch of wet clay. It helped to reduce shrinkage and cracking when the new pot was fired in the kiln, making the next generation of pottery stronger and more durable. The ghost of the old pot lived on, reinforcing the new. Perhaps the most visceral example of this reuse everything mentality can be found in the humble animal bone. In a world where protein was precious, an animal was a treasure trove of resources. After a pig or a cow was butchered, the meat was eaten or preserved. The hide was tanned into leather. The fat was rendered into tallow for candles or cooking, or saved for that soap making we mentioned. But the bones were just getting started. First, they would be boiled, and boiled again, and probably boiled a third time. They were thrown into the perpetual stew pot that simmered over the fire, a process that extracted every last bit of marrow, collagen, and nutritional value, creating a thin but life-sustaining broth. Only when the bones were boiled to absolute tastelessness was their culinary journey over. But their useful life? Oh, it was far from finished. Bone, once it's cleaned and dried, is a fantastic raw material. It's hard, durable, and can be shaped. The long, straight bones of a cow's leg could be carved and polished into needles, which were essential for that constant mending of clothes. They could be fashioned into combs, essential for personal grooming and for combing lice out of hair. A constant and unwelcome companion, smaller bones could be shaped into buttons or toggles for clothing. They were made into handles for knives and other small tools. They were carved into game pieces for chess, checkers, or dice. A little bit of leisure carved from the remnants of dinner, even the shoulder blade of a cow. A large flat piece of bone could be used as a makeshift shovel or scraper. In some of the earliest medieval settlements in London, archaeologists found ice skates made from polished horse bones, strapped to the bottom of shoes to glide across the frozen Thames. So when you imagine a medieval peasant's home, don't imagine it as empty. Imagine it as a place of managed, practical clutter. In a corner there's a small pile of broken pottery shards waiting to be ground into grog. Hanging from a peg is a bag of rags, sorted by size and material. There's a bundle of carefully straightened, used nails. A small box might contain a collection of boiled bones, waiting for a winter evening when they can be carved into a new set of buttons. This isn't hoarding as we'd understand it. This is a library of raw materials. It's an insurance policy against a future of want. It's a physical manifestation of the deep-seated belief that nothing is ever truly finished. So if clothing, metal, wood, pottery, and bone weren't considered trash, what was? What was the actual refuse that people had to deal with? The answer is overwhelmingly, almost exclusively, organic. The waste of a medieval household consisted of things like vegetable peelings, nutshells, eggshells, and the bits of gristle or fat that were truly inedible. It was the straw from the floor that had become too soaked with mud, spilled ale, and other things to be useful. It was the droppings from the chickens that often shared the living space, and most significantly, it was human and animal excrement. But here is the most crucial shift in mindset we have to make. To us, this list of things sounds like a disgusting, smelly pile of garbage. To the medieval mind, it sounded like a different word entirely: fertilizer. In an agricultural society, the health of the soil was the difference between life and death. The constant cycle of planting and harvesting drained the earth of its nutrients, and in a world without chemical fertilizers, there was only one way to put those nutrients back: compost. The midden, or dung heap, that was a feature of every rural backyard wasn't a landfill. It was a carefully tended, vital part of the agricultural process. Every scrap of organic matter went onto that pile. Food scraps were often fed directly to the pigs, themselves little walking recycling units, efficiently converting leftovers back into bacon. But what the pigs wouldn't eat went to the heap: the soiled straw from the floor, rich with nitrogen from animal and human waste, was a key ingredient. The contents of the chamber pot were unceremoniously added each morning. This pile of waste was, in fact, a pile of black gold. It was the promise of next year's harvest. It would be left to rot and decompose, and then, in the spring, it would be laboriously carted out to the fields and spread over the soil, returning the nutrients that had been taken out. This concept even extended to the cities. The waste from a medieval town was a sought-after commodity. Urban centres were sinks of nutrients. Food was brought in from the countryside, consumed by the populace, and then, well, it had to go somewhere. The material collected by men known as gong farmers or night soil men, who had the unenviable job of cleaning out the city's cesspits and latrines under the cover of darkness, was not dumped in a river. It was sold. It was carted out of the city walls and sold to the farmers in the surrounding region, who eagerly bought it to enrich their fields. There was a literal economy built around the recycling of human waste back into the food chain. This entire worldview, this ecology of scarcity, was underpinned by the prevailing social and religious beliefs of the time. The Christian faith, which dominated every aspect of medieval life, preached against wastefulness. Waste not, want not, wasn't just a folksy saying, it was a moral imperative. Gluttony was a deadly sin, and by extension, wasting the food that God had provided was an affront to his bounty. Sloth and poor stewardship of one's resources were seen as deep character flaws. In a small, tightly knit village community, this wasn't just an abstract moral code, it was a matter of social pressure. Your neighbours knew if you were thrifty or wasteful. They could see if your tunic was well mended or ragged through neglect. They could see if your tools were cared for or left to rust. In a world where everyone's survival was interconnected, one family's wastefulness could impact the entire community's delicate balance. To be wasteful was to be a bad Christian and a bad neighbour. So when we look back at this period, we aren't looking at a world without waste. We are looking at a world that defined waste in a way that is almost totally alien to us. Their waste was, with very few exceptions, biodegradable. It was organic. It was in its essence part of a cycle. It came from the earth, and it was destined to return to the earth, to fuel the next cycle of life. The problem for them was not one of disposal, because almost nothing was truly disposed of. The problem was one of management, of smell, of hygiene, and of what happens when this intensely organic circular system gets overwhelmed in the crowded, dirty, and ever-growing towns and cities. We've established the mindset, this deep-seated instinct for reuse and repair that was born from a world of profound material scarcity. They were the original zero wasters, not out of choice or trend, but out of brutal necessity. But just because everything had a potential future use, doesn't mean the system was clean or efficient or pleasant to live in. Far from it. That ever-present pile of resources, the midden heap, the cesspit, the muck in the streets, created a whole new set of challenges. And it is there, in the smelly, dirty reality of managing this organic world, that our story will turn next. We've seen the philosophy, now we must brace ourselves and begin to explore the practice. Chapter 2. The Urban Quagmire. Life and Law Amidst the City Midden. And so we move from the philosophy to the practice. We leave behind the relative, if odorous, logic of the rural farmstead, where every scrap had a purpose, and we walk towards the city gates. We trade the wide, muddy track for the narrow, constricted lane, and here the sheer mathematics of humanity begin to change the equation of waste entirely. What happens when you take that principle of waste not, want not, and concentrate it? What happens when 1,000 households, each with their own midden heap, their own cesspit, their own daily collection of slops and bones and ashes, are crammed together inside a stone wall? The answer, as we're about to discover, is a kind of slow-motion environmental catastrophe, a living, breathing and profoundly smelly organism of a city, constantly trying to digest itself and largely failing. The medieval city was a marvel of burgeoning trade, of soaring cathedrals, of new ideas, but to get to any of those things, you first had to navigate the street, and the street was a challenge. Let's begin our journey there, on foot. Imagine you are a traveller, arriving in, say, London or Paris or York in the 14th century. The first thing you notice isn't the architecture, it's the sound and the smell and the feeling under your boots. There is no neat pavement, no clean asphalt sidewalk. You are walking on dirt, and because it rains in Europe, you are mostly walking on mud, not pleasant, garden-variety mud, but a deep, viscous, clinging quagmire, churned by the hooves of horses, the iron-rimmed wheels of carts, and the tramp of 1,000 feet. This mud is not just soil and water. It is a thick, organic soup, a historical record of everything that has been dropped, spilled, or discarded. In its dark, damp embrace you'll find rotting straw from animal bedding, discarded cabbage leaves from a market stall, the stray chicken bone tossed from a doorway, and a near-constant supply of dung from the horses, oxen and dogs that share the thoroughfare. The street had a texture, a squelch and a suck to it that would pull at your shoes. Walking was an athletic activity. Most streets were designed with a slight dip in the middle. This channel, known as a kennel, was the ancestor of the modern gutter, and its job was to carry away rainwater. In theory, in practice it was a sluggish open sewer, a repository for a constant stream of contributions. When a butcher slaughtered a pig, the blood and offal he didn't want would be sluiced into the kennel. When a dyer finished with a vat of foul-smelling chemicals, it would join the flow. And when a housewife had a bucket of dirty water, or the day's collection of slops, well, that too would find its way into this central artery of filth. The smell is something we have to try and build in our minds, layer by layer, because it's so alien to our sanitized world. You can't just say it smelled bad. It was a complex symphony of odors, a kind of nasal assault. The bass note was damp earth and decay. On top of that, you had the sharp, acrid smell of animal manure, a constant presence. Then you would walk past a tannery, and a wave of chemical stench mixed with rotting hides would hit you so hard it could make your eyes water. A few steps further, and you're near the fishmonger's stall, with the scent of old fish mingling with the briny smell of oysters, whose shells were discarded by the thousand. We find vast mounds of them in archaeological digs. Oysters were the fast food of the Middle Ages, and their shells were the disposable packaging. Over all of this, like a heavy blanket, was the smell of wood smoke from countless hearths, a smell we might find cosy today, but there it was, thick, inescapable, and laden with soot, and woven through it all was the most pervasive and personal smell of all, that of human waste. In a city with no public sewer system and very few private privies, the management of human excrement was a daily public negotiation. Now look up. The buildings themselves seem to huddle together, leaning over the street. The upper stories, often built of lighter timber and plaster, would jut out over the ground floor in a construction called a jetty. Your upstairs neighbour's floor was your ceiling, but it was also a roof over a small part of the street. This was done to maximise living space on a small plot of land, but the cumulative effect was to create narrow, dark canyons. Sunlight struggled to reach the mud below. These overhangs made the streets feel more like tunnels than open roads, trapping the air, the smells and the dampness. And from the windows of those upper floors came another hazard, the chamber pot. This was the universal medieval toilet, a simple ceramic or pewter pot, kept under the bed or in a corner of the room. When it was full, it had to be emptied. The most convenient place to empty it was, of course, the street below. In some more considerate cities, there were rules. You were supposed to shout a warning. The famous cry was "Gardez l'eau," French for "watch out for the water." Over time in England, this became corrupted into the slang "Gardez l'eau." Hearing that cry was your cue to flatten yourself against a wall and hope for the best. So you have this street, a dark, muddy obstacle course of animal waste, discarded food, and industrial runoff, all under the constant threat of being doused with the contents of a stranger's chamber pot. If you think your commute is stressful, imagine that your biggest worry wasn't traffic, but trench foot and tetanus. And we haven't even gotten inside a house yet. Let's step carefully through a doorway and into a typical medieval townhouse. The shop might be on the ground floor, facing the street, with the family's living quarters on the floors above. Space was at a premium. These were not large, airy homes. They were cramped, dark and crowded, often with multiple generations, and maybe an apprentice or two, living under one roof. Just like on the farm, waste was generated daily. The primary source was the hearth, the fireplace that served as the home's engine. It provided heat for warmth and cooking, and light to see by. It also produced a constant supply of ash and soot. Ash was actually one of the less problematic wastes. It could be collected and used for various things. It was a key ingredient in making lye for soap. It could be spread on icy paths in the winter to provide traction. It could even be used as a scouring powder for cleaning pots. This was one of the few waste products that was dry, relatively inert, and genuinely useful. The bigger problem was the wet waste. This was everything from the water used for washing vegetables to the grimy water from washing people, which didn't happen nearly as often as we'd like to think. And of course the slops from the kitchen. Slops were the leftovers. Vegetable peels, bits of gristle, stale bread, bones from a roast. In the countryside, this would have been a feast for the pigs. In the city, it was a conundrum. Some households might keep a pig in a small backyard sty, but for many, the slops just went into a bucket, and when the bucket was full, it followed the chamber pot out into the street. It was a donation to the great public soup flowing down the kennel. Now for the most pressing issue of all. The chamber pot was a temporary solution, but where did it all go in the long run? For the slightly more well-to-do, the answer was the cesspit. A cesspit was, to put it politely, a hole in the ground. It was the medieval septic tank, without any of the tank, in the small backyard or courtyard behind the house, or sometimes even in the cellar. A pit would be dug. This pit would be the final destination for the household sewage. Sometimes, if you were fortunate, it was lined with stone or brick. More often, it was just an unlined hole dug into the clay soil. A wooden shack, the privy or garderobe, might be built over it. In a multi-story house, a vertical chute might connect a privy on an upper floor directly to the pit below. This was the height of medieval convenience. You didn't even have to go downstairs. But the cesspit was a ticking time bomb of filth. An unlined pit would constantly leak its toxic contents into the surrounding soil. This was a disaster waiting to happen. The number one casualty was the water supply. Most households got their water from a well, often dug in the very same small backyard. You can see the problem. You have a pit of seeping human waste just a few feet away from the hole you're drawing your drinking, cooking, and washing water from. The connection between this contamination and diseases like cholera and typhoid was centuries away from being understood. To them, water that looked clear was clean. It was a fatal assumption. The pits also had to be emptied. They would fill up year after year, creating a solid, compacted mass of unimaginable foulness. If they weren't emptied, they would overflow. An overflowing cesspit in your cellar is a homeowner's nightmare that transcends time. And sometimes the pressure of the surrounding earth, softened by the leaking contents, would cause the pit's walls to collapse. There are grim court records from medieval London detailing neighbours suing each other because one person's cesspit collapsed and flooded the adjacent cellar with its contents. Imagine having that conversation with your neighbour. Forget borrowing a cup of sugar. You're asking them to help you deal with a literal flood of filth. It put arguments over property lines into a rather stark perspective. For the vast majority of the urban poor, a private cesspit wasn't an option. They lived in single, rented rooms, packed into tenements. Their waste simply joined the public domain. It went into the street, or into the nearest river, and this is where the scale of the problem really explodes. A single household tossing a bucket of waste into the street is a nuisance. 1,000 households doing it creates a public health crisis. The rivers that ran through these cities, the Thames in London, the Seine in Paris, the Foss in York, were simultaneously the primary source of drinking water and the primary public sewer. Every trade, every household, saw the river as a convenient, God-given conveyor belt to take their problems away. Butchers' guilds would build their slaughterhouses right on the riverbank, with chutes designed to send blood, entrails and offal directly into the current. Tanners would pour their vats of animal hair and toxic chemicals into the water, and the kennels from the streets, carrying their slurry of mud and waste, all eventually drained into the river. People downstream, of course, were still drinking this water. They would also do their laundry in it, and fish from it. There was a vague understanding that this wasn't ideal. People knew that the water near a dyer's workshop tasted strange, or that the river was particularly foul downstream from the shambles, the butcher's quarter. But the connection to disease was a mystery. They blamed it on miasma, or bad air, and to be fair, the air was spectacularly bad. The idea that invisible creatures in the water could kill you was the stuff of fantasy. So if private solutions were inadequate, and often dangerous, and the rivers were becoming open sewers, where did the solid waste go? What about the things that couldn't be poured away? The broken pottery, the old shoes, the mountains of oyster shells, the bones, the rotting straw from bedding. This accumulated in the great public dunghill, or midden. These were official, or sometimes unofficial, dumping grounds. They could be located at the end of a street, in a neglected public square, or, most commonly, just outside the city walls. These middens were not discreet. They were mountains, towering, reeking monuments to the city's consumption. Archaeologists love them because they offer a perfectly layered snapshot of medieval life, a cross-section of what people ate, what they wore, what tools they used, and what broke. For the people living near them, they were less a treasure and more a festering, fly-blown torment. The midden was its own ecosystem. In the summer, it would steam and bake in the sun, the stench rolling over the nearby neighbourhoods. In the winter, it would freeze into a solid, grotesque sculpture. It was a paradise for rats, a breeding ground for flies, and a foraging site for the city's unofficial sanitation department, the animals. We have this image of cities as being devoid of livestock, but the medieval city was more like a dense, urban farm, and the undisputed king of the sanitation crew was the pig. For much of the Middle Ages, pigs were allowed to roam freely through the streets of many cities, including London. They were walking garbage disposals. They would eat almost anything: vegetable scraps, discarded bread, offal, and even grimly, human and animal excrement. They were incredibly efficient at turning the city's waste back into a source of protein. A family might own a pig, let it wander the streets to fatten itself up for free on the public refuse, and then slaughter it in the autumn. It was a perfect, if unsavoury, cycle. Of course, free-roaming pigs came with their own set of problems. They were a traffic hazard, getting under the wheels of carts. They could be aggressive, and there are records of them attacking children. Their rooting and wallowing could destroy the already precarious surface of the street. Eventually, cities began to regulate them. Ordinances were passed, decreeing that pigs had to be kept in sties. If a pig was found wandering, it could be confiscated. Some laws required owners to put a ring in the pig's nose to discourage it from rooting up the lanes. But for a long time, the pig was an essential, if chaotic, part of the urban waste management system. Alongside the pigs were the dogs. Packs of semi-feral dogs roamed the city, surviving on what they could scavenge. They were thinner and tougher than our pampered pets, more like wolves living on the margins. They cleaned up bones and other scraps, but also added to the general filth and were a known vector for diseases like rabies. And then there was the cleanup crew from the sky. Medieval cities were home to huge populations of birds of prey, particularly the red kite. In London, these birds were so valuable for their role in cleaning the streets that they were protected by royal decree. Killing a kite was a serious offence. These magnificent birds would circle over the city, their keen eyes spotting any discarded piece of meat or entrails in the streets below. They would swoop down into the narrow lanes, snatch up the offal from a butcher's stall or a dead rat from the gutter, and fly away. They were the city's vultures, a beautiful and slightly terrifying part of the daily spectacle, constantly scouring the city for its leavings. Ravens and crows, too, played their part, hopping through the muck, picking at anything remotely edible. This chaotic system of individuals dumping waste, of sluggish kennels, of roaming pigs and scavenging birds, was the default for centuries. But as towns grew into cities and cities became more crowded, the sheer volume of filth began to overwhelm. The streets became impassable. The stench became unbearable. And slowly, tentatively, the idea of civic responsibility began to emerge. The notion that the cleanliness of a public street was, perhaps, a public problem. This was the birth of sanitation law. It didn't happen overnight. It was a slow, piecemeal process, usually prompted by a specific complaint. A group of wealthy merchants might complain to the city council that the street outside their shops was so clogged with dung and filth that customers couldn't reach them, or an outbreak of sickness attributed to miasma might be blamed on a particularly foul-smelling midden heap. The earliest laws were simple prohibitions. In 1357, King Edward III looked out of his palace at Westminster, took a deep breath of the air coming off the Thames, and was so disgusted by the stench of the butcher's waste being thrown into the river that he issued a proclamation. He forbade anyone from throwing dung, filth, entrails, or other ordure into the Thames, on pain of a hefty fine. This is a classic example of an early sanitation law. It identified a problem, forbade it, and set a punishment. Did it work? Not really. The law was almost impossible to enforce. Who was going to police every foot of the riverbank day and night? For a butcher, the fine was simply a potential cost of doing business, weighed against the immense convenience of using the river as a dump. But it was a start. It was an official recognition that one person's convenience could be another person's, or even the king's unbearable stench. Similar laws cropped up across Europe. Ordinances were passed to regulate the hours during which you could empty your chamber pot into the street, usually only after dark, when fewer people were about. Laws mandated that every householder was responsible for cleaning the portion of the street directly in front of their property. You were expected to sweep the filth from your frontage to the central kennel. This, of course, just moved the problem a few feet, but it was an attempt to impose order on the chaos. Some cities tried to regulate polluting trades. They would attempt to confine the smelliest industries, like tanning, dyeing, and butchering, to specific districts, usually downwind or downstream from the main population centres. This was an early form of zoning, driven entirely by the desire to keep the worst smells away from the most powerful noses. But all these laws against dumping, against roaming pigs for street cleaning, ran into the same fundamental problem: enforcement. It's one thing to make a rule, it's another to make people follow it, especially when following it is inconvenient and breaking it is easy. Who's going to report their neighbour for emptying a slop bucket at noon instead of 9 p.m? The medieval world didn't have a dedicated police force for this kind of thing. What it did have, however, were the beginnings of municipal employment. As cities grew wealthier and more organised, they began to realise that prohibitions alone weren't enough. They needed to provide a service. They needed to hire people to do the dirty work. This led to the creation of the first public sanitation workers. In England, they were often called raakers. Their job was simple and unenviable. They were hired by the city, or a specific ward within the city, to go through the streets with a horse and cart and rake up the filth. They would shovel the stinking morass of mud, dung and garbage from the streets into their carts and haul it away. Where did they haul it? To those official dumps, the middens, outside the city walls. So the rakers weren't so much eliminating the waste as they were relocating it. They were concentrating the problem in a few designated spots. This was a huge step forward. It meant the streets, at least periodically, might be scraped clean enough to be navigable. It represented the first time a city government took collective financial responsibility for the state of its public spaces. The raker's cart, rumbling through the streets, was a symbol of a new era of civic consciousness. It was a smelly, humble, but revolutionary vehicle. The rackers dealt with the public mess. But what about the private mess? What about the ever-filling cesspits? Emptying a cesspit was not a job for amateurs. It was difficult, disgusting, and incredibly dangerous. This was a task for a specialist who, over time, acquired a number of names, the most famous of which is the gong farmer. The name is wonderfully strange. Gong was an Old English word for a drain or a privy, so a gong farmer was, literally, a privy harvester. They were also known as nightmen, because by law this was a job that could only be performed at night. The reasoning was obvious. The smell was so overpowering, so profoundly offensive, that to do this work in the daylight hours, amidst the hustle and bustle of the city, was simply unthinkable. It had to be done under the cover of darkness when most good citizens were asleep, their windows shuttered tight. The work of the gong farmer is something we must approach with a degree of reverence. It was one of the most essential and one of the most reviled jobs in the entire medieval world. When a household's cesspit was full, they would hire a team of gong farmers. This team, usually 2 or 3 men, would arrive after curfew. They would come with their tools, buckets, ropes, shovels, and a small sealed cart. The first man, the whole man, would be lowered into the cesspit itself. He would stand, sometimes waist or chest deep, in the accumulated, compacted filth of years. The pit would be thick with human excrement, but also with everything else that had been dropped or thrown down the privy hole: lost coins, broken pottery, animal bones, even, occasionally, the skeletons of unwanted pets. The whole man's job was to shovel this solid mass, this night soil, into a bucket. His partner, the rope man, would stand at the surface, hauling up the filled buckets one by one and emptying them into the cart. It was back-breaking, repetitive labour, performed in near-total darkness, illuminated only by the faint light of a lantern, and it was incredibly dangerous. The decomposing waste in a cesspit released toxic gases, primarily methane and hydrogen sulfide. Gong farmers could be, and often were, overcome by the fumes. They could pass out and drown in the very filth they were hired to remove. The pit walls, as we've discussed, could also collapse. It was a job with a shockingly high mortality rate. For this risk, and for the profound social stigma attached to the work, gong farmers were paid surprisingly well. They could earn a very good living, far more than a typical labourer, but that money came at a cost. They were social outcasts. Their work made them ritually and literally unclean. They were often forced to live in specific, isolated parts of the city. People would avoid them on the street. The stench of their trade clung to them, a permanent mark of their profession. They were a walking, talking embodiment of the filth that polite society produced but refused to acknowledge. Once their cart was full, they had to transport the night soil out of the city. They would lead their horse and cart through the silent, sleeping streets to a designated lay stall or dump outside the walls. But the story doesn't end there. This material, this night soil, was valuable. It was one of the richest sources of nitrogen and phosphate available, making it a superb fertilizer. The gong farmers would often sell their cargo to actual farmers in the countryside surrounding the city, who would use it to enrich their fields. And so, in the dead of night, the cycle was completed. The nutrients that had been brought into the city in the form of food were, through this grim and dangerous process, carted back out to the fields to grow more food. The gong farmer, this despised and essential figure, was the linchpin in a vast organic recycling system. He was the man who turned the city's most private and shameful waste back into a source of life. Let's just pause and reflect on that for a moment. Think of all the layers of organization required. A household recognizes a problem. They engage a specialist contractor. That contractor performs a hazardous job according to strict municipal regulations, at night only. They then transport the waste to a designated disposal site. And finally, they participate in a secondary market, selling the processed waste as a commodity. This is not a primitive system. It is a complex, regulated, and surprisingly sophisticated response to a problem that was threatening to choke the life out of the city. The urban quagmire of the Middle Ages was a place of incredible contradiction. It was a place of innovation and stagnation, of community and filth, of soaring ambition and base survival. Life was lived in a state of sensory overload. The noise was constant, the crowds were thick, and the smells were a part of your every waking moment. People developed a tolerance for things that would make us physically ill. A certain level of street-level filth was just the background noise of life. Yet, they were not oblivious. They knew that the stink was unpleasant. They knew that an impassable street was bad for business. They knew that a fouled river was not good to drink from, even if they didn't understand the germ theory behind it. And so they fought back. They fought back with household rules, with wandering pigs, with new laws and regulations, and with the grim nocturnal labour of the raka and the gong farmer. It was a constant, losing battle. The cities grew faster than their sanitation systems could ever hope to keep up with. For every street a raker cleaned, 3 more were being fouled. For every cesspit a gong farmer emptied, a dozen more were filling up. The problem of urban waste was not solved in the Middle Ages, not by a long shot. The great public health revolutions of sewers and clean water were still centuries in the future. But what we see in the High Middle Ages is the beginning, the first dawning awareness that living together in a city requires a different set of rules. It requires a negotiation between private liberty, the freedom to throw your trash wherever is easiest, and the public good. We see the birth of the idea that a city is a shared space, and that its health and function are a shared responsibility. And so, as we leave the medieval city, let's leave it at night. The daytime chaos has subsided. The streets are empty, save for a few watchmen and the prowling dogs. The air is cooler now, and perhaps the stench is a little less potent. And somewhere, in a dark back lane, a lantern glows. You hear the scrape of a shovel, the creak of a rope and pulley. It is the sound of the gong farmer at his work, the sound of the city, in its sleep, trying to cleanse itself, readying itself for another day. It is the sound of a hidden, silent, and unending war against the refuse of our own existence. A war that in many ways we are still fighting today, just with slightly better tools, and thankfully a great deal more soap. Chapter 3. The Rural Cycle. Manure, middens, and the manor's metabolism. And as the gong farmer finishes his lonely work in the city, let's leave him to it. Let's pull back from that cramped, dark lane, leaving the scent of lye and the damp stone behind. We are going to step outside the city walls, further and further, past the haphazard slums that cling to its skirts, beyond the reach of the tolling city bells. We're heading out into the open country, where the air smells different. It's not necessarily what you'd call fresh in the way we think of it. It's not the crisp, clean scent of pine or meadow flowers. It's something far more earthy, more fundamental. It's the smell of wood smoke, of damp soil, of livestock, and of the slow, steady and unending process of decay. Because out here, in the sprawling manors and tiny villages that fed the kingdom, the entire concept of waste was turned on its head. In the city, trash was a problem to be solved, a danger to be removed. In the country, what the city called trash was currency. It was life. It was the very fuel that powered the engine of survival. Welcome to the great rural cycle, a closed-loop system so efficient that a modern sustainability expert would weep with joy. This was the manor's metabolism, a constant process of consumption, digestion, and excretion, where nothing, and I mean almost nothing, was ever truly thrown away. To understand this, we need to shrink our focus, right down to the heart of the rural world, the peasant household. Forget stone castles for a moment, and picture a small, timber-framed cottage. It's what historians politely call a cruck house, which means its basic frame is made of a few large, curved timbers that meet at the top, like a wishbone. The walls are not brick or stone, but wattle and daub, a charming name for what is essentially a basket weave of sticks, smeared with a hearty plaster of mud, clay, straw, and for that extra bit of binding power, animal dung. There is no foundation. The house sits directly on the earth, and when you step inside, the first thing you notice is the floor, or rather, the lack of one. It's just packed earth, and covering it is a thick layer of rushes, straw or bracken. This isn't a decorative choice. This isn't medieval carpet. This is a piece of slow-motion technology. This floor is alive. Throughout the day, everything falls onto these rushes. When the family eats their humble meal of pottage and dark bread, the crumbs fall, the drips of ale, the gnawed-on bones, the vegetable peelings from the pot. They all disappear into the floor. The mud tracked in on their boots, the droppings from the chickens that might wander in and out. It all becomes part of this ever-thickening mat. You see, the rushes served as a kind of giant absorbent sponge for daily life. It insulated the cold earth a little, and it kept the mud from being quite so, muddy. But its real job was to be a repository, a collection plate for organic matter. This wasn't cleaned in the way we think of it. You wouldn't get out a broom and a dustpan. You simply added a new layer of fresh rushes on top when the current layer got too fragrant or too squelchy. It was the medieval equivalent of just throwing a new rug over a stain, except you did it for months on end. Now, look to the centre of the single room. There's no chimney, just a hole in the thatched roof. Below it is the hearth, the fire. This is the home's command center. It provides light, it provides warmth, and it cooks the food, and it too produces a form of waste, ash. But ash wasn't waste. Wood ash was rich in potash and other minerals. It could be mixed with water and animal fat to make a crude, caustic soap for the toughest stains on linen. It could be spread in the garden to enrich the soil and deter slugs. It was a valuable byproduct, carefully collected, so you have the slow composting of the rush floor and the useful ash from the fire. But the real heart of this rural economy, the true source of its wealth, lies just outside the back door. Out there you will find the midden heap. It doesn't sound glamorous, and believe me, it wasn't. This was the family's personal, open-air compost pile and waste dump, all rolled into one, and it was a thing of profound importance. When the rush floor inside the cottage finally became too high, too saturated, too impossibly ripe to simply cover over again, a great clear-out would happen. The entire stinking, matted, semi-decomposed layer would be scraped off the earthen floor and carted out to the midden. This was a treasure trove of nitrogen. To this, everything else was added, all the kitchen scraps that didn't go to the pigs. The contents of the chamber pot, the night soil, human waste was an absolutely essential ingredient, rich in phosphates and nitrogen that plants crave. This is a concept we are deeply squeamish about today, but in the medieval mindset, it was just another part of the cycle. It came from the earth in the form of food, and it was simply being returned to the earth to make more food. There was a simple, beautiful, and slightly smelly logic to it. And then, of course, there were the animals. Most peasant families would have some livestock, and they often lived in startling proximity to the family. A cow or a few pigs might have a lean-to shelter attached to the cottage itself, sharing a wall. In the coldest months, they might even be brought inside, their body heat adding a few precious degrees to the room's temperature. A family's survival could depend on that single pig or cow. But these animals were not just a source of food, milk, or leather. They were miniature fertilizer factories. The manure they produced was, without any exaggeration, brown gold. It was the single most important commodity for ensuring a good harvest. Every dropping was collected. The floor of the animal pen, rich with soiled straw and dung, would be periodically cleared out and added, with a sense of profound satisfaction to the growing midden heap. Think of it less as a pet owner's messy chore, and more as a daily deposit into your agricultural savings account. The more manure you had, the richer your midden, and the richer your midden, the more food you would grow. It was a direct and unbreakable line. The midden wasn't just a pile of stinking refuse. It was a slow-motion chemical reactor. Over the months, the layers of rush, food scraps, night soil, and manure would sit and stew. Bacteria and fungi would go to work, breaking it all down, generating a surprising amount of heat in the process. It was a living, breathing mound of future prosperity. Villagers understood this alchemy intimately. They knew that the longer it was left, the darker, richer, and more potent it became. This wasn't just dumping, it was cultivation, and this entire system was governed by the rhythm of the seasons. Throughout the autumn and the long, cold winter, the midden heap grew. It was a time of accumulation. The family huddled inside, the animals stayed close, and the pile in the back grew layer by fragrant layer. It was a sleeping giant of fertility, waiting for its moment. Then, in the early spring, as the ground began to thaw, the great work began. This was the time for muck spreading. The now well-rotted contents of the midden were loaded onto a small cart, or perhaps just into baskets, and laboriously hauled out to the family's strips of land in the communal fields. This was back-breaking, foul-smelling work, but it was also an act of profound hope. With every shovel flung across the cold, bare earth, a prayer was being offered, a prayer for a good harvest. This dark, crumbly, nutrient-rich material was the difference between a plump loaf of bread and a thin, watery gruel. It was the difference between life and death. The fields of a medieval manor were typically run on a 3-field system. One field would be planted with a winter crop like wheat or rye, another with a spring crop like oats or beans, and the third would be left fallow, unplanted, to rest and recover its nutrients. And it was this fallow field that received the lion's share of the midden's bounty. The muck was spread, then ploughed into the soil, replenishing it, revitalizing it, preparing it to bear crops again the following year. The peasant didn't own this land, of course. He worked it for the lord of the manor, and the lord was just as obsessed with this cycle as his tenants were, if not more so. The productivity of his land was the source of his wealth, his power, his entire position in the world. He understood the value of manure. In fact, some of the most potent fertilizer was a privilege reserved for the lord alone. If you saw a stone tower on a manor, it wasn't always for defense. It might be a dovecote. The lord had the exclusive right to keep pigeons or doves, and their droppings, collected from the floor of the dovecote, were a super fertilizer, so incredibly rich in nitrates and phosphates that it was like a secret weapon for his personal gardens or select fields. A peasant caught stealing the lord's pigeon dung could be in for a severe punishment. Waste was serious business. The lord's own livestock, the great herds of cattle and flocks of sheep, were also a crucial part of this. Sometimes, peasants could pay for the privilege of having the lord's sheep graze on their fallow strips after harvest. This wasn't just for clearing the stubble, it was for the manure the sheep would leave behind. A practice known as folding. A field that had been folded was a field that would yield a better crop. So you see, in the countryside, every single element was woven together. The family, the house, the animals, and the land were not separate entities. They were organs in a single functioning body. The rushes on the floor absorbed the scraps of a meal grown in a field that was fertilized by the decomposed rushes from the year before. The pig that ate the vegetable peelings produced manure that would help grow next year's vegetables. The human being who ate the bread and beans would return those nutrients to the earth to grow more bread and beans. It was a perfect, contained loop. It wasn't born from a philosophy of environmentalism. It was born of grim necessity. There was no municipal collection service. There was no corner store to buy a bag of chemical fertilizer. You had what you could produce, and what you could reuse. Scarcity was the mother of this incredible, sustainable invention. And so, as night falls over the fields, the air is still. The midden heap steams gently in the cool air, a quiet promise of the spring to come. Inside the cottage, the family sleeps, perhaps with a calf or a few chickens nearby, all of them breathing the same smoky air. There is no sense of waste as a problem here. There is only the slow, rhythmic and deeply reassuring pulse of the great cycle. The turning of the earth, the return of its gifts, a system of survival, written not in laws or books but in the dark, rich soil itself. Chapter 4. The effluent of industry, the butcher, the tanner and the dyer. That slow, rhythmic pulse. It's a beautiful thought, isn't it? The perfect closed loop of the countryside. A world where nothing is ever truly thrown away, merely transformed, where the end of one thing is simply the beginning of another. It's a comforting, almost sacred rhythm, but that rhythm, so steady and true in the quiet of the fields and forests, begins to falter as we draw closer to the town, as the scattered homesteads and manors begin to cluster, huddling together for safety and commerce. A new sound enters the symphony, a human sound. It's the sound of hundreds, and then thousands of lives lived in close proximity, and with that sound comes a different kind of pulse, a different kind of cycle. It's faster, more demanding, and far, far messier. Because what is a town, really, but a concentration of human need, the need for food, for clothing, for tools, for shelter, and meeting those needs at scale that requires industry. Not industry as we might picture it, with towering smokestacks and deafening machinery, but industry all the same. Craftsmen, artisans, tradesmen, all working to turn raw materials into finished goods, and every single one of these trades, from the most humble to the most vital, produced its own unique and often challenging signature of waste. The closed loop of the countryside begins to break open here. Under the pressure of specialization, the problem of waste is no longer about one family's midden heap. It's now a communal issue, a tide of refuse that threatens to overwhelm the very streets and streams that give the town life. We're moving beyond the simple peels and bones of the domestic kitchen and entering the world of what were politely known as the nuisance trades, and they earned that name with an almost artistic dedication. Let's begin our tour of these industries in the most visceral, the most immediate, and arguably the most infamous district of any medieval town. You wouldn't need a map to find it. You would simply follow your nose, and perhaps the faint reddish-brown tint of the water in the gutters. We're going to the shambles, The very word sounds messy, disorganized, and it's a perfect description. This was the butcher's quarter, the beating, bleeding heart of the town's food supply. In our world, the process of turning a living animal into a steak is a sterile, hidden affair, conducted far away in anonymous concrete buildings. For the medieval town dweller, it was street theatre. The shambles weren't just a row of shops. They were abattoirs and retail outlets rolled into one bloody package. The air here would have been thick with a cacophony of sounds. The desperate cries of animals, the sharp rhythmic chop of cleavers on massive wooden blocks, the haggling of customers, the buzzing of a truly biblical number of flies. Animals were often slaughtered right there in the street, or in the open-fronted stalls. Blood would pour from their throats, a hot steaming torrent that flowed directly into the central gutter or kennel of the cobblestone street. It would mingle with the rainwater, the household slops, and anything else that had been tossed out, creating a grim, slow-moving river of red. Now, a single butcher might process a few animals a week, but a street lined with them, all serving a bustling town, the sheer volume of liquid waste was staggering. And it wasn't just the blood. The real challenge was the offal, the guts, the intestines, the stomachs, the lungs, the spleens, all the internal architecture of the animal that wasn't considered prime meat. Some of it could be used, of course. Intestines were cleaned for sausage casings, stomachs could be made into tripe, but much of it was simply refuse. Great steaming piles of entrails would be heaped up, waiting for disposal, and disposal was a very generous term. More often than not, it meant being unceremoniously dumped into the nearest river. Imagine a river, the town's primary source for drinking water, for washing clothes, for brewing ale, suddenly having to contend with a daily avalanche of blood and guts. The water would be permanently stained, the banks slick with decaying organic matter. It's a public health nightmare from our perspective, and even then, people knew it was a problem. Not because they understood germ theory, but because they understood the evidence of their own senses. It stank, it attracted vermin, and people who drank the water downstream tended to get very, very sick. And then there were the bones, mountains of them. Once every last scrap of meat and gristle had been boiled off for soups or fed to the dogs, you were left with the skeleton. These would accumulate in vast, stinking bone heaps, often just outside the city walls. They were a raw material for craftsmen, who made everything from buttons and combs to knife handles and tiny, intricate religious carvings, but the supply of bones far, far outstripped the demand. So the heaps just grew, monuments of consumption slowly bleaching in the sun and rain. The butchers' guilds, which were powerful organizations, tried to police their own. They had to. Public outcry was a constant threat. Rules were put in place. You might be fined for slaughtering an animal in the main street after a certain hour. You might be ordered to carry your offal and blood in buckets to a designated dumping spot on the river, usually at night, so the more respectable citizens wouldn't have to witness the grim parade. In some progressive towns like London, there were concerted efforts to centralize the butchering process. They built a long pier out over the Thames, a sort of public abattoir, with chutes that would carry the blood and entrails directly into the fast-moving current, hoping it would simply be washed away to someone else's problem downriver. It was the medieval equivalent of building a taller smokestack. It didn't solve the pollution, it just relocated it. The shambles was the first, most obvious offender in the industrial pollution of the medieval town. It was a trade defined by its byproducts, blood, guts and bones. But the butcher also produced one other crucial piece of waste, which in turn became the lifeblood of our next nuisance trade. After all the meat was carved away, after the bones were tossed on the pile, you were still left with the animal's single largest organ, its skin, and a raw, decomposing animal hide is not a useful thing. To turn it into the strong, supple, durable material we call leather, you had to take it to a man whose profession was so notoriously foul, so fundamentally based on stench and decay, that his very presence could lower property values for an entire district. You had to take it to the tanner. If the butcher's trade was an assault on the eyes, the tannerer's was a full-scale chemical and olfactory war on the senses. Tannerers were, without exception, relegated to the most undesirable parts of town. They were always situated downstream and, if possible, downwind. To live upwind of a tannery was a sign of considerable social status. Let's follow a fresh hide on its journey from the shambles to the tanner's yard. It arrives stiff with dried blood, still covered in patches of fat and flesh, and already beginning to smell of decay. The first step is to get it clean. It's tossed into the river, or a large vat of water to be soaked and washed. Already the water is being polluted with the first round of filth. Next, the hair has to go. To do this, the tanner submerged the hides for days or even weeks in a pit filled with a solution of slaked lime. These lime pits were a permanent feature of any tannery, bubbling away with a caustic alkaline brew. The process loosened the hairs, which could then be scraped off with a blunt knife. The air around these pits would have been thick with the smell of wet animal and harsh chemicals, a smell that would cling to the tanner's clothes, his hair, his very skin. After dehairing, the hide was soft and pliable, but not yet ready. There were still trace fats and proteins within the skin that would cause it to rot if left untreated, and to remove them, the tanners turned to a process that even their contemporaries found deeply unpleasant. It was a form of enzymatic treatment, and they needed a reliable source of enzymes. They found it in a process called baiting, or more descriptively, puring, and it involved soaking the hides in a warm, disgusting bath of water mixed with animal dung, often dog dung, which was collected from the streets by children who could earn a few pennies for a bucketful. Sometimes pigeon droppings were used, considered a slightly more refined option for finer leathers. Can you just take a moment to imagine that? A series of large, open vats, filled with a warm slurry of water and feces, in which men, often up to their elbows or knees, would work the animal hides to soften and purify them. The stench is almost beyond our modern comprehension. It was a sour, acidic, deeply foul odour that was the tanner's constant companion. This was artisanal biochemistry at its most primal. The enzymes in the dung broke down the last of the unwanted proteins, leaving the collagen of the hide perfectly prepared for the final stage. But the cost was a smell that could make a hardened soldier gag. The liquid waste from these puring pits, a toxic cocktail of bacteria and dissolved animal matter, was of course flushed straight into the river. Only now, after this multi-stage trial by ordeal, was the hide ready to become leather. It was stretched onto a frame and submerged in yet another series of pits, this time filled with a solution of tannin. This was usually derived from soaking crushed oak bark in water. Compared to the previous steps, this part of the process was almost pleasant, smelling vaguely of a damp forest floor. The hides would soak in these tannin liquors for months, sometimes over a year, for thick sole leather, slowly absorbing the chemicals that would preserve them permanently, cross-linking the collagen fibers, and turning the decaying skin into a stable, durable material. But every single step of this process generated waste. The scraped-off hair, the bits of flesh and fat, the spent lime solutions, the truly horrifying effluent from the baiting pits, and the dark, used-up tannin liquors. It all went one place, the local watercourse. A stream that ran past a tannery was known as a tanner's runnel, and it was effectively an open sewer. The water would be devoid of fish, the banks coated in a greasy, multicoloured slime. It was water that couldn't be used for anything. It wouldn't even be used to put out a fire unless the situation was truly desperate. The tanner, therefore, was a paradoxical figure. He was essential. Without leather, you have no shoes, no belts, no saddles, no harnesses, no water skins, no armour. A town could not function without him, but he was also a pariah. His work was physically demanding, incredibly skilled, and utterly disgusting. The location of the tanneries physically shaped the social geography of the medieval city. The land around them was cheap, inhabited by the poor and the marginalised, who had no choice but to live with the ever-present gut-wrenching stench. To be a tanner was to be perpetually stained by your trade, a master of a vital craft that everyone needed and no one wanted to see or smell being done. So we have the butcher polluting the river with blood and gore, and the tanner poisoning it with a chemical soup of lime, dung and bark liquor. But there was another major industry, one often seen as cleaner and more respectable, that was just as guilty of turning the town's rivers into sewers. This was the cloth trade, the engine of the medieval economy in many regions, and at the heart of the cloth trade's environmental impact was the desire for one simple thing: colour. Plain, undyed wool or linen was the stuff of peasants, but for anyone with a bit of money, colour was a status symbol. A vibrant red cloak, a deep blue tunic. These were signs of wealth and taste. and achieving those brilliant lasting colors required a complex process involving not just dyes but also chemicals called mordants. Before a cloth could be dyed, it had to be thoroughly cleaned and prepared. Wool, as it comes from the sheep, is full of grease, dirt, and what was politely called swint, a mixture of dried sweat and natural oils. To remove this, the wool was scoured, often using soap made from animal fat and wood ash, or more commonly, stale urine. Yes, urine again. It seems to be a recurring theme in medieval industry. The ammonia in aged urine was a powerful and, more importantly, free degreasing agent. Large tubs were kept to collect it. In some cloth-making towns, households would leave buckets outside their doors for the lant collectors to pick up. This was then used to wash the raw wool, producing yet another stream of unpleasant effluent destined for the river. After washing, the cloth was often fulled. This was a process designed to thicken and felt the woven fibers, making the cloth heavier and more durable. It involved pounding the wet cloth for hours, either by foot in a trough, a job for walkers. This process also used a cleaning agent, like fuller's earth, a type of clay that absorbed oils. But again, stale urine was a common additive. The runoff from the fulling mills was a slurry of clay, wool fibers, grease, and lant. Once the cloth was clean and fulled, it was ready for the dyer, and this is where the real chemical pollution began. In order to make a dye bind permanently to a fiber, you need a mordant. The mordant acts as a chemical bridge, locking the color molecule to the wool or linen. Without it, the color would just wash out in the first rain. The most common and desirable mordant was alumum, a metallic salt that was mined in specific parts of the world and was a valuable commodity. It was relatively clean to use, but other, less savory mordants were also employed, including iron salts which would sadden colors, and even more toxic compounds of tin, copper, or lead for achieving specific shades. And of course, there was urine, its ammonia acting as a mordant for certain types of dyes. The dyes themselves came from the natural world: madder root for red, weld for yellow, and most famously, woad for blue. The woad plant's leaves had to be fermented to produce the indigo dye, and you can probably guess what was used as the fermentation agent. That's right, a vat of woad leaves, steeped in stale urine and heated, produced a smell that was said to rival even the tanner's yard for sheer unpleasantness. The dyer's workshop was a steamy, colourful and pungent place. Great cauldrons bubbled over wood fires, filled with water, mordants and dye stuffs. The dyer, his hands and arms permanently stained the colour of his specialty, would carefully work the lengths of cloth in these hot chemical brews. And when the desired shade was achieved, what happened to the spent dye bath? The thousands of gallons of water, now cooled and laden with leftover mordants, metallic salts and residual dye. It was poured straight into the river. On any given day, the river downstream from the dyer's quarter might run a different colour. A cloudy crimson red on Monday when the madder vats were emptied, a murky chemical blue on Tuesday from the woad, a jaundiced yellow on Wednesday. You could tell what colour was in fashion by looking at the water. It was a spectacular form of pollution, visible and undeniable. This chemical waste was lethal to fish and aquatic life. It made the water completely unfit for human or animal consumption. It was the price of a vibrant economy, a price paid by the river and by everyone who lived downstream. So you have these three titans of medieval industry, all clustered within the town walls, all utterly essential for its survival and prosperity. The butcher feeding the populace, his trade written in blood in the streets. The tanner, shodding the people and harnessing their animals, cloaked in a miasma of chemical decay. And the dyer, clothing the citizens in the colours of status, painting the river with the effluent of his craft. They were not villains. They were skilled artisans, members of powerful guilds, men who were often respected pillars of their community. They weren't polluting out of malice. They were simply practicing their trades as they had been practiced for generations. The concept of an environment as a fragile system to be protected was completely alien. The river was seen as a divine gift, a self-cleaning utility provided by God to carry away the town's filth. The idea that you could permanently damage such a mighty thing as a river was unthinkable. Out of sight, out of mind. And yet, they knew there were problems. The endless complaints about the smells, the legal disputes between guilds over water rights, an upstream guild polluting the water that a downstream guild needed for its own process. The constant tension between the economic necessity of these trades and the simple human desire to live in a town that wasn't an open sewer, this tension is what led to the very first tentative steps towards urban planning and pollution control. The regulations, the fines, the zoning that pushed the worst offenders to the margins. It was a constant battle, a negotiation between industry and livability that was waged street by street, river by river. The waste they produced wasn't just a nuisance. It was a force that actively shaped the physical and social landscape of the medieval world, carving out districts of stench and sickness, and leaving scars on the water that would take centuries to heal. They were grappling with a problem that we still struggle with today: how to live with the consequences of our own ingenuity. The refuse of their success was the town's greatest challenge. Chapter 5: Waterways, the universal source and sewer. And so we come to the final destination for so much of this challenge, the ultimate answer to the question that plagued every medieval town: where does it all go? All that refuse, the daily output of a burgeoning population, had to flow somewhere. And just as it is today, the path of least resistance was always downhill. Every ditch, every gutter, every purposefully carved channel in the street was a tributary, designed by hope or by accident, to lead to the same place. They all fed into the town's great, tireless and entirely uncomplaining workhorse, the river. The river was the town's main artery, its central nervous system, and its biggest, most convenient and most catastrophic mistake. It was the universal source and the universal sewer, a paradox that medieval people lived and died with every single day. The water that flowed through their lives was a story, a long and winding narrative that began with purity and ended, almost invariably, in filth. Let's imagine ourselves standing on a grassy hill just outside a large medieval city, say London, in the 14th century. Up here, the River Thames is still a country river. It's wide and relatively clear. The water might be a bit brown with silt, but it smells of damp earth and greenery. You can see fish darting in the shallows. This is the river in its innocent, idealized state. This is the water that the wealthiest estates, the monasteries with their sprawling lands, would have access to. They could pipe it in, build their water mills on its cleaner currents, and enjoy the river as nature intended. This was the premium subscription, the water in its purest form. Now, let's follow that water on its journey into the heart of the city. As it enters the town's orbit, the first thing it encounters are the outer industries. Perhaps a few fullers, using the current to wash and felt wool, releasing urine and clay into the flow. A little further, the first of the city's many mills, its great wooden wheel churning the water, a gentle but constant disruption. But the real change begins as the river slides past the city walls and becomes a truly urban waterway. This is where the concept of upstream and downstream became one of the most important social and economic dividers in medieval life. It was a hierarchy written in water. Those who lived upstream had the privilege of first use. They got the water before it had accumulated the full catalogue of the city's sins. To live downstream was to inherit everyone else's problems. It was to receive a constant, flowing delivery of everything the city wanted to forget. The first major contributors were, of course, the people themselves. Public latrines, known as gongs or jakes, were often built directly over the river or a tributary. London Bridge was famous for its houses, shops, and yes, its latrines that emptied directly into the Thames below. For those living a bit further from the riverbank, the problem of their own waste was solved by a simple bucket and a short walk. The river was nature's flushing toilet, a system that required no plumbing, no maintenance, and no thought. Out of sight, out of mind. The river, it was assumed, was big enough. It would simply carry it all away to the sea, a problem solved. But the sea was a long way off, and the river moved at its own pace. It didn't so much remove the waste as redistribute it. It became a slow-moving soup of human effluent, swirling and eddying along the banks, clinging to bridge piers, and settling in quiet backwaters. This domestic contribution was a constant, steady stream of pollution, but it was the industries that truly turned the waterways into a nightmare. Let's take a walk along our medieval riverbank and meet the key offenders. First, we smell them. It's a uniquely foul odour, a mix of rot and harsh chemicals that catches in the back of your throat. We've found the tanners, Tanning leather was a vital medieval industry, but it was also one of the most grotesquely polluting processes imaginable. To prepare animal hides, tanners would first soak them in the river to loosen flesh and hair. Then the hides were submerged in vats of lime to remove the hair completely. And this slaked lime, full of dissolved animal protein and hair, was often just dumped back into the water, turning it a milky, caustic white. But that was just the beginning. The next step was to make the hides supple, and the preferred method for this was a process charmingly called baiting. This involved pounding dung, often dog or pigeon dung, which was prized for its enzymes, into the hides. After that, they were soaked in vats of urine or solutions of tannin from oak bark. Every single step of this process produced a foul, toxic liquid, and where did it all go? Straight into the river. The tanner's quarter of a town was an assault on the senses. The river here would be thick with floating hair, scraps of fat and flesh, and discoloured by a chemical cocktail that would kill any fish for miles. They were the undisputed heavy metal rock stars of river pollution, and their presence could render a stretch of river biologically dead. Moving downstream, we come to the butchers. Their contribution was less chemical, but far more visceral. The shambles. The butcher's street was infamous for its filth. All the waste products of their trade, the blood, the entrails, the bones, the offal, was swept out of the shops and into the gutters, which of course led directly to the river. On a busy day, a stream flowing from the butcher's quarter would literally run red with blood. Animal intestines would float by like pale, ghostly serpents. The smell of iron and decay would hang heavy in the air. This wasn't just pollution, it was a daily horror show, a constant graphic reminder of the slaughter that fed the city. The river became a charnel house, its currents carrying the discarded pieces of thousands of animals. Then came the dyers. Their pollution was, in a strange way, more beautiful, but no less harmful. They used a vast array of substances to colour textiles: woad for blue, madder for red, and various metallic salts and mordants like alum to fix the colours. Their vats of spent dye were emptied into the river, creating swirls of unnatural, vibrant colour. A casual observer might even find it pretty, a ribbon of sapphire blue or ruby red flowing through the grey-brown city. But these were toxic chemicals. They poisoned the water and the riverbed, creating a deceptively beautiful, but entirely lethal environment. Even something as seemingly innocent as doing the laundry was a polluting activity. Fullers, who cleaned and thickened cloth, would use fuller's earth, a type of clay, and vast quantities of urine, collected in pots left on street corners, for its ammonia content. The cloth was trampled in these mixtures, and then rinsed. All of it, the clay, the urine, the grime, went straight back into the very water source that people downstream were expected to drink from. So you see, by the time the river reached the far end of the city, it was less a river and more a communal drain. It was a thick, slow-moving liquid, opaque with human and animal waste, chemical runoff, and household garbage. It was a conveyor belt of filth, and the people living downstream were at the end of the line, left to deal with the accumulated refuse of an entire city. Naturally, people knew this water was not ideal. The concept of germ theory was centuries away, but you didn't need a microscope to see that the river was disgusting. You could smell it, you could see the filth floating in it, and you instinctively knew that drinking it was a terrible idea. This led to a desperate, city-wide quest for any alternative source of clean water. The most common alternative was the well. Digging a well seemed like the perfect solution. You were bypassing the tainted surface water and tapping into the clean, filtered groundwater deep beneath the earth. A private well in your courtyard was a status symbol, a sign of wealth and a promise of health. Public wells were scattered throughout the city, providing a vital resource for those who couldn't afford their own. But here lies the tragic irony of medieval sanitation. The well was often just a delayed delivery system for the very same pollutants. The ground beneath a medieval city was not a pristine filter. It was saturated. It was saturated with the contents of thousands of leaking cesspits, which were often little more than unlined pits dug in a backyard. It was saturated with the runoff from the streets that seeped between the cobblestones. And grimly, it was saturated with the decomposing matter from the city's overflowing graveyards, which were often located right in the centre of town, next to the church. The groundwater that fed the wells was often just cesspit and graveyard-filtered water. It might look clear, having been strained through the soil, but it was teeming with invisible dangers. People would lower their bucket into the cool, dark well, pull up what looked like clean, fresh water, and be drinking a diluted cocktail of their entire neighborhood's waste. A cholera or typhoid outbreak could spread like wildfire, not just from the river, but from the very wells that people believed were keeping them safe. They were digging for a solution and finding only yesterday's problems, recycled and delivered fresh to their cup. The more forward-thinking cities, and the wealthier ones, recognized this problem and invested in what was, for the time, incredible high-tech infrastructure, conduits. These were systems designed to bring fresh water from springs or clean streams far outside the city walls and deliver it to public fountains within the town. This was a true municipal triumph. The Great Conduit in London, for example, was a marvel of medieval engineering, a network of lead pipes that ran for miles to bring clean water to the city centre. These public fountains or cisterns became vital social hubs. They were stone structures, often ornately carved, with spigots from which a steady, precious trickle of clean water flowed. Here, water carriers, mostly women and apprentices, would gather to fill their buckets and barrels. They would wait for hours, gossiping, arguing, and exchanging news. The fountain was the medieval water cooler, the heart of the neighborhood. But it was also a logistical bottleneck. The flow was often slow, and demand was immense. Rules were established to maintain order. There was no washing your laundry or your horse in the fountain's basin. You took your turn. You didn't push. Fights could break out over a place in line, and the system was fragile. The lead pipes could break, the source spring could run low in a drought, and the entire system required constant, expensive maintenance, paid for by taxes or wealthy benefactors. For most citizens, getting a bucket of clean water was a significant part of their daily labor. It wasn't something you just turned a handle to get. It was something you worked for and something you cherished. And so medieval society was a world of two waters. There was the running water of the river, abundant and easy to access, but visibly and dangerously foul, good for industry, for transport, for turning a water wheel, but not for drinking if you could help it. And then there was the sweet water from the conduits, and the cleaner wells, precious, limited, and the subject of immense effort and regulation. Your health, and indeed your life, could depend entirely on which water you had access to. The consequences of this system were written in the parish death records. Dysentery, often called the bloody flux, was a common killer. Typhoid and cholera, though not understood as waterborne diseases, would sweep through urban populations, leaving devastation in their wake. A hot, dry summer would lower the river levels, concentrating the filth, and also dry up the cleaner wells and springs, forcing more people to turn to the toxic river out of sheer desperation. These were the times of plague and sickness, and the river was very often the silent accomplice. The water that was meant to give life was a constant, unrelenting threat. It was a lottery with every single sip. People weren't ignorant of this. They just felt powerless, but they did try to fight back. From the 13th century onwards, we see a growing body of laws and regulations aimed at curbing the worst of the water pollution. These were early, faltering steps toward environmental legislation. Butchers in London were ordered, repeatedly, to take their offal and waste outside the city walls, or to dispose of it, only at high tide. Tanners were often legally pushed to the downstream edge of town, effectively creating a sacrifice zone where their pollution would be the last thing to enter the river before it left the city. There were fines for dumping waste directly into the Thames from a boat. In 1388, the English Parliament passed an act that is considered by some to be the first nationwide anti-pollution law in history. It forbade the dumping of dung, garbage, entrails, and other ordure into ditches, rivers, and other waters. The problem was enforcement. A city guard might fine a servant for tossing a bucket of waste off a bridge, but how could they possibly police every single household and workshop? The economic power of the trade guilds, like the tanners and butchers, was immense. They were vital to the city's economy. Forcing them to stop polluting would have meant forcing them to stop working. It was a battle between public health and economic necessity, and necessity almost always won. The laws were a statement of intent, a recognition of the problem, but they were a flimsy shield against the daily tide of filth. The river remained the path of least resistance, and so the river flowed on, carrying the city's secrets, It was the backdrop to everything. Barges moved up and down it, carrying stone, wool, and wine, their poles stirring up the murky depths. Fishermen cast their nets, hoping to find a few hardy eels or fish that had somehow survived the onslaught, their catch tasting of the mud and pollution it grew in. Children played near its banks, a constant source of worry for their parents. Lovers met under its bridges, the foul smell just a part of the city's familiar perfume. At night, when the city quieted down, the sound of the water would become more apparent, a gentle lapping against stone walls, a steady current moving out to sea. In the moonlight, the surface might even look beautiful, silvered and mysterious, but it was a deceptive beauty. It was a river burdened with the health of a city. It absorbed everything, forgave nothing, and simply carried it all along, a dark, liquid history of life and death, ingenuity and ignorance, all flowing silently together through the heart of the sleeping town. Chapter 6. The Anatomy of a Stench. Miasma Theory, Vermin and Public Health. That dark, liquid history, flowing silently together through the heart of the sleeping town, didn't just carry away the physical refuse of the day. It carried something else, something invisible, yet deeply, profoundly felt by every person living along its banks. It carried a scent, and in the medieval mind, that scent was far more than an unpleasantness. It was a warning, it was a threat, it was, quite literally, the smell of death. As the moon tracked its way across the sky, and a slight breeze stirred from the water, it would lift this invisible presence from the surface of the river and guide it through the narrow streets. It wasn't one smell, but a complex tapestry of decay. It was the sour tang of human waste, the sharp, metallic note of blood from the butcher's drain, the dull, earthy rot of discarded vegetables, all mingling into a single, cohesive entity, a presence that could creep under your door, seep through the gaps in your window shutters, and find you even in the supposed safety of your bed. Tonight we're going to step into that world and try to understand not just the smell itself, but what it meant. Because to understand the medieval relationship with filth, you have to understand their theory of everything when it came to sickness. You have to understand the terrifying, all-encompassing power of miasma. The word itself sounds wonderfully archaic, miasma, like something out of a fantasy novel, but for centuries, it was the most advanced, cutting-edge medical theory they had. And when you think about it from their perspective, it makes a chilling amount of sense. What do sick people, rotting things, and stagnant swamps all have in common? They smell bad. They produce a foul air. Therefore, they concluded, it must be the air itself, the bad air, the miasma, that carries the sickness. It was a ghost, an invisible, malevolent fog that rose from any place of corruption or decay. That dung heap at the end of the street wasn't just an eyesore. It was a little factory, puffing out invisible clouds of pestilence. The local tanner, soaking hides in vats of urine and lime, wasn't just a smelly neighbour. He was a potential public enemy, poisoning the very air the community breathed. Every dead animal left in a ditch, every pool of stagnant water, every overflowing privy was seen as a breach in the city's defences, allowing this spectral enemy to gain a foothold. Imagine living with that constant, low-grade fear. It's a level of anxiety we can barely comprehend. We worry about germs we can't see, but we understand the mechanics of them. We wash our hands, we cover our mouths when we cough. Their enemy was just as invisible, but it was everywhere. It was the air itself. How do you fight the air? How do you run from something that follows you into every room, that you must draw into your own lungs just to live? This theory transformed the sensory experience of medieval life. Every foul odour was a potential death sentence. A butcher's shambles on a hot day, buzzing with flies and reeking of offal, wasn't just disgusting. In the shadow of the Black Death, it was terrifying. You would walk past, perhaps pulling your cloak over your nose and mouth, hurrying your steps, praying that you hadn't breathed in a fatal dose of corrupted vapour. The stench wasn't a symptom of the problem. It was the problem. It was the disease itself, in its airborne, gaseous form. And this belief created a whole new ecosystem of fear, one that focused on the creatures who seemed to thrive in these places of decay, the silent, unwelcome business partners of humanity, the vermin. Let's start with the undisputed king of the medieval city's underbelly, the rat, specifically the black rat. Smaller, nimbler, and a better climber than its modern brown cousin, the black rat was a master of infiltration. They were a constant, scurrying presence in the fabric of everyday life. You'd hear them at night, a frantic scrabbling in the thatched roof above your head, or a faint scratching from within the wattle and daub walls. You'd see a dark shape dart across the dirt floor, disappearing into a shadow. They were in the granaries, in the bakeries, in the taverns, and in the homes. They were, of course, drawn by the very thing we've been talking about, the trash, the endless accessible buffet that was a medieval street, a discarded crust of bread, a pile of fish bones, a spilled sack of grain. It was all a feast. The dunghills were their castles, warm and full of decomposing, edible treasures. They were a pest, a nuisance. They spoiled food, gnawed through cloth, and were generally seen as a sign of uncleanliness and decay. But here's the crucial part. Nobody saw them as the cause of the plague. In the miasmatic worldview, the rats weren't the assassins. They were just another piece of evidence. They were fellow travellers in the world of filth. Their presence simply confirmed that a place was corrupt, that the conditions were right for bad air to be generated. If you saw a lot of rats, it was a sure sign that the miasma in that area was particularly strong. They were a symptom, like a cough or a fever, not the disease itself. They were the canary in the coal mine, and the canary was coughing. This misunderstanding is one of history's great and tragic ironies. The real killer wasn't the rat, but its tiny, silent passenger, the flea. The flea was an utterly mundane part of life. In a world of straw mattresses, woolen clothes that were rarely washed, and close quarters with animals, everyone had flea bites. They were an itchy, irritating fact of existence, like mosquito bites on a summer evening. No one in their right mind would ever connect these common, everyday itches with the apocalyptic disease that could wipe out a third of the continent. Imagine trying to make that connection. It would be like us trying to prove that blinking too fast causes thunderstorms. The leap in logic was simply too vast. The real vector of the Black Death, Yersinia pestis, lived in the gut of the flea, which in turn lived on the rat. When the rat died, the hungry fleas would jump to the next warm body they could find, often a human. The flea would bite, regurgitating the bacteria into the bloodstream, and the clock would start ticking, but all the human knew was that they had an itch. Days later, when the fever and the horrifying buboes appeared, their mind would immediately go to the one thing they believed caused disease: bad air. Did they walk past the tanner's yard? Did they linger too long near the butcher's shop? Was there a foul smell coming from their own privy? That's where the blame would lie. The flea, the rat, the real culprits, scurried away in the darkness, completely unsuspected. And it wasn't just the rats and fleas. The entire ecosystem of filth was viewed through this lens of miasma. Think of the flies. On a summer day, the meat stalls, the shambles, would be surrounded by a literal cloud of them, a thick, buzzing, shimmering haze that you would have to wave your hands to part as you walked through. To us, it's disgusting. We think of germs, of flies landing on filth and then on food. To them, it was more primal. Flies were seen as creatures of spontaneous generation, born directly from rotting meat and decay. They were the very children of corruption. Their presence in such numbers was living proof that the meat was giving off a powerful miasma, that the air itself was putrid and dangerous. The buzzing wasn't just an annoying sound, it was the sound of disease being born. This belief system, this deep-seated fear of bad air, governed the public health response. If the enemy is a killer smell, then the only logical way to fight it is with a better, stronger, cleaner smell. This led to what you might call an aromatic arms race. On a personal level, anyone who could afford it would carry some kind of defense system. The most famous of these is the pomander. This was typically a small ball of perforated metal, often silver or gold, that you would fill with aromatic substances, things like cloves, cinnamon, nutmeg, and heavy musky scents like ambergris, which is charmingly a waxy substance from the digestive system of a sperm whale. You would hold this little personal air freshener to your nose whenever you were in a particularly smelly, and therefore dangerous part of town. It was a pocket-sized force field, an attempt to create a tiny bubble of good air for you to breathe as you moved through the corrupted world. For those less well-off, the solution was simpler: a posy of flowers or a handful of fragrant herbs like rosemary or lavender. This is the origin of the nursery rhyme Ring-a-Ring-a Roses with its line, "A pocket full of posies." It wasn't a whimsical fashion accessory, it was a desperate personal anti-plague device. The belief was that the sweet, clean scent of the herbs would ward off the deadly miasma, purifying the air before it entered your lungs. Inside the home, the battle continued. People would burn fragrant woods like juniper and pine, filling the house with a thick, resinous smoke. The goal wasn't just to make the room smell nice, it was to fumigate it. The smoke was a weapon, actively cleansing the space, seeking out and destroying the invisible tendrils of bad air that might have seeped in from outside. They would sprinkle herbs on the floor along with the rushes, so that every footstep would crush them and release a little puff of protective scent. Vinegar, with its sharp, clean smell, would be washed over floors and furniture. It was a constant, fragrant war against an unseen enemy. During a major outbreak, like a visitation of the plague, these efforts would be scaled up to a city-wide level. The authorities would order massive bonfires to be lit on street corners. Imagine that scene, a city already shrouded in a permanent haze of wood smoke from thousands of hearths. Now with great pyres burning day and night, the air, thick and acrid, would sting your eyes and catch in your throat. But this choking smoke was seen as the height of public health technology. The heat and the powerful smell were thought to be a brute force method of cleansing the entire city's atmosphere, burning away the pestilence. And because filth was seen as the factory of miasma, plague outbreaks would trigger frantic city-wide cleaning campaigns. Suddenly, those civic ordinances about not dumping your waste in the street weren't just about keeping up appearances, they were a matter of life and death. The town crier would go around, ordering citizens to clean the street in front of their homes immediately. The rakers, the official street cleaners, would work overtime, their carts piling high with refuse that had been ignored for weeks. That pile of rotting garbage on the corner, once just a smelly nuisance, was now regarded with the same terror as an unexploded bomb. It had to be removed, disposed of, before its deadly vapor could infect the whole neighborhood. This is where we see the most tragic and ironic of all their public health measures. In their desperate attempt to eliminate the sources of corruption, authorities would often order the mass culling of animals, specifically cats and dogs. Why? Because they were part of the street-level ecosystem of filth. They were seen as unclean, as carriers of dirt, and therefore potential generators of miasma. So during a plague, the dog catchers would be sent out, and thousands of stray dogs and cats would be killed. The terrible, heartbreaking irony is that they were systematically destroying the single most effective predator of the rat. By killing the cats, they were inadvertently rolling out the red carpet for the very creature that was carrying the plague-infested fleas. With their natural enemy gone, the rat population could explode, spreading the disease even faster and further. They were fighting the wrong enemy, with the wrong weapons, and in the process they were accidentally aiding the true killer. It's a devastating example of how a logical, evidence-based conclusion based on the wrong evidence can lead to catastrophic results. So let us settle back into that quiet, medieval room for a moment. The day is done. The city outside is hushed, but it's not a peaceful quiet. It's a fearful one. Perhaps the death cart, the bell on it tolling a slow, grim rhythm, has already passed down your street. Inside, you've done everything you can. A small fire of juniper wood smoulders in the hearth, not for warmth but for protection. The air is thick with its sharp, clean smoke, mixing with the scent of lavender you've strewn on the floor. You lie on your straw mattress, the scratchy wool of your blanket pulled up to your chin. In your hand, you might be clutching a cloth filled with cloves and rosemary, holding it near your face, breathing through it. Every breath is a conscious decision. Every strange smell from outside, a wisp of something foul drifting through a crack in the wall, sends a jolt of adrenaline through you. You listen. You listen for the sounds of coughing from your neighbor's house. You listen for the telltale cry of a household that has found one of its own marked by the plague. You are surrounded by a world of smells, and you have been taught to interpret them as a language of life and death. The smell of baking bread is the smell of safety and community. The smell of wood smoke is the smell of a protected hearth. But the smell of decay, of stagnation, of filth, that is the voice of the enemy. An enemy you can't see, can't touch, but whose presence you can feel in the very air you breathe. They were fighting a ghost, waging a war against a phantom, and the deep, pervasive stench of their world was not just an inconvenience, it was the constant, unnerving soundtrack to that war. A reminder that in a world without germ theory, danger was everywhere, riding on the gentlest of breezes, hiding in the most mundane of shadows. and as you try to drift off to sleep, you can only hope that your little cloud of rosemary-scented air will be enough to keep the monster at bay, at least for one more night. Chapter 7. The slow dawn of sanitation. Paving, proclamations and civic pride. That little cloud of rosemary-scented air. It was a personal shield, a fragile, fragrant bubble in an ocean of miasma. It was one person's quiet declaration of defiance against the invisible enemy. But a single shield, no matter how aromatic, cannot hold back the tide. And as the towns of the later Middle Ages swelled, as the press of humanity grew denser, and the lanes grew narrower, and the piles of refuse grew ever higher, the tide was turning into a flood. The monster of the miasma was no longer a phantom lurking in the shadows. It was a guest that had overstayed its welcome, taken up residence in the heart of the city, and refused to leave. And eventually, even those in the highest, most perfumed towers began to notice, because a king can surround himself with all the incense and pomanders in the world, but when he rides through his own capital city, even he has to breathe the same air as everyone else. And so we arrive at the beginning of a new idea, a slow, creaking, groaning dawn of an idea, but a dawn nonetheless. The idea that perhaps, just perhaps, the responsibility for the ever-present filth wasn't solely on the individual who had to step over it. Perhaps the sheer scale of the problem demanded a response on a grander scale. This wasn't a sudden epiphany, a moment of brilliant insight into germ theory. It was something far more practical, born of pure sensory overload and royal inconvenience. It was the moment when the powers that be, from city alderman to the king himself, finally looked around, pinched their noses, and decided that something, anything, had to be done. The age of purely private waste management was drawing to a close, and the first hesitant steps toward a collective civic responsibility were about to be taken. It often began, as so many medieval initiatives did, with a strongly worded letter from the boss, a royal proclamation. Picture King Edward III of England, a man not known for his delicate sensibilities, a warrior king who had seen the grime and gore of the battlefield. Yet even he found the state of London streets to be, to put it mildly, a bit much. In 1349, with the terror of the Black Death still a fresh and terrifying memory, he issued a proclamation. The miasma theory was at its peak. The belief that disease was carried on bad air was the closest thing they had to a scientific consensus, and the air in London was by all accounts spectacularly bad. The proclamation declared that the air in the said city is very much corrupted and infected by the dumping of dung and lay stalls and other filth in the streets and lanes. Let's pause and appreciate the language. It's not a public health announcement as we would know it. It's a complaint. It's the king, as the ultimate landlord, telling his tenants to clean up their act. The decree ordered the mayor and sheriffs to have the city cleaned of all filth, and to cause it to be proclaimed and strictly forbidden that anyone should henceforth dump their refuse in the public ways. The penalty for doing so, pain of imprisonment, and the king's grievous forfeiture. It sounds impressive, doesn't it? A direct order from the throne. You'd think the streets would be sparkling within a week, but the reality of medieval governance was that a proclamation was often little more than a suggestion shouted into a hurricane. Enforcement was the real issue. The city had a handful of officials, and a population of tens of thousands, each with a lifetime of habit, telling them that the street was the natural destination for a bucket of anything and everything. How do you police every window, every doorway? Who is going to stand on a corner all day waiting to catch someone tossing out fish guts, just to collect a fine of a few pence? The proclamation was a statement of intent, a landmark acknowledgement that a problem existed on a city-wide level. But it was like trying to empty the ocean with a teaspoon. The muck remained, and so these proclamations became a recurring theme, a sort of legislative Groundhog Day. A king would ride into town, be appalled, issue a decree, and ride out again. The city would make a brief, half-hearted effort to tidy up, and then, slowly, entropy would take over. The habits were too deep, the infrastructure too non-existent. In 1388, under Richard II, the English Parliament passed what some have called the first real nationwide anti-pollution statute. It forbade the dumping of dung, garbage, entrails, and other ordure into ditches, rivers, and other waters. The reasoning given was that it caused many maladies and other intolerable diseases. Again, the connection was there. The dots between filth and sickness were being connected, even if the mechanism was misunderstood. But the act, like the proclamations before it, was more of an aspiration than a practical solution. It identified the problem, but it didn't provide the tools to solve it. It was a law against mud in a world made of mud. It was in Paris, perhaps, that the first truly transformative step was taken, and it wasn't a law but a physical change to the very ground beneath their feet. It was a solution born not of health concerns, but of royal disgust. The story goes that around the year 1186, King Philip Augustus was standing at a window in his palace on the Ile de la Cité, looking out over one of the main thoroughfares. A heavy cart rumbled by, its wheels churning the thick primordial ooze that passed for a street surface. The churning motion released a wave of such a profound and offensive stench that the king, a man hardened by war and politics, was physically overcome. He nearly fainted, and in that moment of royal nausea, a decision was made. He would not endure it any longer. He decreed that the main streets of Paris were to be paved. This was a revolutionary concept. For centuries, the European street had been a porous, organic thing. It was dirt and gravel at best, a repository of everything that fell or was thrown into it. It drank up the rain, the slop, the blood from the butcher shops, and turned it all into a thick, semi-liquid stew. You didn't walk on a street, you waded through it. The idea of creating a solid, impermeable surface was a radical departure. It was an attempt to tame the street, to draw a clear line between the city and the primordial muck. The project was massive, expensive, and slow. They laid down large, irregular flagstones, creating a pavement in the truest sense of the word, and the effect was immediate and profound. For the first time, a street had a solid floor. Rain, instead of creating more mud, could now theoretically wash the surface clean, carrying debris along with it towards the river. It was no longer a sponge, but a basin. You could sweep a paved street. Think about that for a second. The very concept of sweeping a street was nonsensical. Before paving, it would be like trying to sweep a swamp. Paving created the possibility of cleanliness. Of course, this wasn't an altruistic city-wide beautification project. It began with the most important streets, the ones the king and his court used. It was about creating a respectable, less smelly corridor for the powerful. The side streets, the residential lanes where the vast majority of people lived, remained their old muddy selves for centuries to come. But it was a start. It was a proof of concept. A paved street was a symbol of modernity, of wealth, of civic control. It was the city imposing its will upon the chaos. When you walked from a muddy lane onto a paved thoroughfare, you were crossing a boundary. The sound changed from a wet squelch to a hard clatter. The smell changed from an intense localized reek to a more general ambient city smell. It was a tangible improvement, a small victory in the long war against the filth. London, ever the rival of Paris, followed suit, though more slowly and piece by piece. Streets like Cheapside, the main commercial artery, were among the first to be paved. The funding often came from a variety of sources. Sometimes the king would contribute, other times wealthy merchants would pay to have the street in front of their own properties paved, both for their own convenience and as a very public display of their wealth and civic virtue. Guilds might pave their own quarters. It was a patchwork, an incremental process that would take hundreds of a year. Each newly paved section was a small island of order in a sea of muck. But paving a street, while a huge step forward, only solves half the problem. It gives you a surface you can clean, but it doesn't remove the waste itself, and it does nothing to address the most personal and persistent source of urban waste, human excrement. The chamber pot, emptied from a window, was still the primary method of disposal for most city dwellers. The cry of "Gardez l'eau," watch out for the water, was a genuine daily hazard. To truly tackle the sanitation problem, you had to provide an alternative. And so we see the emergence of another remarkable innovation, the public latrine. This wasn't a new idea, of course. The Romans had been masters of public sanitation, with their grand, multi-seat latrines connected to complex sewer systems. But that knowledge, like so much else, had been lost or had fallen into disuse during the early Middle Ages. The reintroduction of the public latrine in a city like London was a major event, a piece of infrastructure on a scale not seen for 1,000 years. The most famous of these was the great latrine built over the Walbrook stream near Cheapside in London. around 1422. This wasn't a small outhouse. It was a substantial stone building, often referred to as a longhouse, which featured an astonishing 128 seats, divided equally between men and women. It was funded by the will of Richard Whittington, the legendary Dick Whittington, a wealthy merchant and 4-time Lord Mayor of London. His legacy wasn't just a folk tale about a cat. It was this very real, very practical gift to the city. Let's imagine this structure for a moment. It sat directly astride the Walbrook, a small river that flowed through the heart of the city on its way to the Thames. The seats were arranged in long rows directly over the channel of running water. The concept was simple, and for the time, brilliant. The current of the stream would act as a natural flushing mechanism, carrying the waste away downstream and out into the greater river. It was a huge improvement over the cesspits that often overflowed, or the simple dumping of pots into the street. For the first time, a significant number of Londoners had access to a dedicated, relatively clean and constantly self-cleaning facility. It was, in its own way, a social centre, a place of strange, anonymous intimacy. Unlike the convivial, chatty atmosphere of a Roman bathhouse latrine, the medieval attitude towards bodily functions was more private, more shaped by Christian ideas of shame. Yet, here you were, one of 64 men or women, sitting in a row, engaged in the most private of acts in a very public space. The very existence of such a place speaks to the crushing pragmatism of medieval urban life. The need for a solution to the overwhelming problem of human waste simply overrode any delicate sensibilities. It was better to have a clean, efficient public facility, even if it lacked privacy, than to continue living in a city that was effectively an open sewer. But again, we must see this through a medieval lens, not a modern one. This marvel of sanitation was, at its core, a system for pollution displacement. It didn't make the waste disappear, it just moved it very efficiently from the city centre into the River Thames. The Thames was London's main source of drinking water, its main fishery, its laundry, its highway, the great latrine, while making life on the streets of Cheapside infinitely more pleasant, was contributing to the slow poisoning of the city's great waterway. They had solved the problem for the nose, but not for the stomach. The connection between contaminated water and diseases like cholera and typhoid was still centuries away. They were fighting the enemy they could see and smell, the filth on the ground, unaware of the far more dangerous invisible enemy they were creating in the water. These large-scale projects, the paving and the public latrines, represent the hardware of the new sanitation movement. But you also need software, the people and systems to make it all work. A paved street is only clean if someone cleans it. And so, alongside these architectural advances, we see the birth of a new profession, the municipal sanitation worker. In London, they were known as rakers. This was their official title. Their job was exactly what it sounded like. Each ward of the city was supposed to hire a raker, who was tasked with going through the streets with a rake and a cart, gathering up the refuse into piles. These piles were not to be left indefinitely. The system required citizens to keep the front of their own properties clear, piling their rubbish up for the raker to collect on his appointed rounds. The raker would then load it onto his cart and haul it to designated dumps outside the city walls, or to lay stalls along the river where it could be loaded onto barges and taken away. This was a fundamental shift in thinking. The responsibility was no longer just on the producer of the waste to get rid of it. Now there was a shared, systematized process. You put your trash out, and the city, in the form of the raker, takes it away. It's the direct ancestor of our modern garbage collection. We can picture this man, the raker. It was not a high-status job. It was dirty, smelly, and poorly paid. He would have been a common sight, a familiar figure in the neighbourhood. His cart and horse are part of the daily rhythm of the city. The sound of his cart's wheels, the smell that accompanied him, the rhythmic scrape of his rake on the cobblestones, this was the sound of civic order in action. The system was, of course, imperfect. There were not enough reckums. The collections were infrequent. People still threw things out of their windows at night. The designated dumps or middens on the city outskirts grew into small mountains of festering waste, creating their own new health hazards for those living near the walls. But it was a system. It was an attempt to manage the chaos, to impose a process on the endless stream of urban detritus. In Paris they had a similar system, with carts called tombereaux that would circulate through the city. Here, the financing was sometimes more explicit. In some districts, a special tax was levied on residents to pay for the waste removal service. This is a truly modern concept, a municipal tax for a public service. It reinforces the idea of a social contract. We all pay a little bit, and in return we get to live in a slightly cleaner, more orderly environment. The very act of collecting this tax was a constant reminder that sanitation was a collective, not just a personal, responsibility. Another specialized and frankly terrifying profession that grew more formalized during this period was that of the gong farmer, or gong firmer. The word gong was an Old English term for dung, or a privy. These were the men who cleaned out private cesspits and privies. This was a night job, for obvious reasons. You did not want the contents of a full cesspit being hauled through the streets in broad daylight. A team of gong farmers would arrive after dark, with their buckets, ropes, and a sealed cart. It was one of the most foul, dangerous jobs imaginable. The fumes in a confined cesspit could be toxic, even lethal. Yet it was essential. A single overflowing cesspit could make a whole building, or even a whole lane, uninhabitable. The gong farmers were, in a way, the elite special forces of medieval sanitation. They dealt with the most concentrated, most hazardous waste. They were well paid for their troubles, precisely because the work was so unpleasant and so necessary. Their existence highlights the growing complexity of urban life. As cities grew, they created problems of a scale that required specialized professional solutions. You could no longer just dig a new hole when the old one was full. You needed experts. The gong farmers, humble and reviled as they might have been, were those experts. So we have proclamations from the king, paved streets, public latrines, and professional rakers and gong farmers. A slow revolution is taking place. But what was truly driving it? Was this the dawn of a new public health consciousness? The evidence suggests that the answer is mostly no, not in the way we'd understand it. While the language of the proclamations often mentioned maladies and corrupted air, their primary motivations seem to have been more about order, convenience, and prestige. A muddy, impassable street was bad for commerce. Carts laden with goods would get stuck for hours, disrupting the flow of trade that was the lifeblood of the city. The street piled high with refuse was an affront to civic order, a sign of poor governance. To a mayor, an alderman, or a king, a clean city was a well-managed city. It was a reflection of their own power and competence. Filth was a form of chaos, and it was the job of a good ruler to impose order on chaos. Then there was the matter of prestige. The great cities of Europe were in constant competition with one another. When a foreign diplomat, a wealthy merchant, or a visiting nobleman arrived, his first impression of the city was formed on its streets. To have him arrive through beautifully paved, clean thoroughfares, to see public fountains and grand structures like the Cheapside latrine, was a statement. It said that this was a wealthy, powerful, modern city. It was the medieval equivalent of having a sleek, efficient airport and a skyline of glittering skyscrapers. Paving a street was as much about public relations as it was about public health. The desire to imitate the classical past also played a role. The scholars and architects of the late Middle Ages and the burgeoning Renaissance were rediscovering the works of ancient Rome. They read about the aqueducts, the sewers, the paved roads of the Roman Empire, and they wanted to emulate that grandeur. Building a public latrine wasn't just about waste management. It was about recreating a piece of that lost, magnificent Roman civilization. It was a way of saying, we too are capable of great public works. We are the inheritors of that legacy. And for the ordinary citizen, the motivations were likely far more immediate. They supported these measures not because they had a working knowledge of epidemiology, but because they didn't want to step in filth on their way to the market. They didn't want the front of their house to smell like a cesspit. They didn't want their children playing in a street that was also a garbage dump. It was about basic quality of life. The desire for a reasonably pleasant sensory environment is a powerful human motivator. The slow dawn of sanitation was driven less by a fear of germs and more by a simple, profound exhaustion with the stench. As we look back on this period, from the vantage point of our sanitized modern world, it's easy to see the flaws. Their solutions were partial, their understanding of disease was wrong, and their best efforts often just shifted the pollution from one place to another. The Thames, having received the flushed-away contents of the Walbrook latrine and the street sweepings from the lay stalls, would grow ever more toxic, leading to even greater public health crises in the centuries to come. But to judge them by our standards is to miss the point. What we are witnessing in the late Middle Ages is not the solution, but the birth of the question itself, the question of who is responsible for public space, the question of whether a city is just a collection of private dwellings or a cohesive entity with collective responsibilities, the proclamations, the paving stones, the public works, the hiring of the first humble raker. These were the first, fumbling answers to that question. They were laying the foundation, quite literally, in the case of the pavers, for the modern city. They were creating the very categories of public service and municipal infrastructure that we now take for granted. Every time you put your recycling bin out on the curb, you are participating in a system whose DNA can be traced back to a London raker with his cart and horse. Every time you use a public restroom in a park or a train station, you are enjoying the legacy of Richard Whittington's grand experiment over the Walbrook. The world was still a filthy, dangerous place. The Great Plagues were not over. The link between water, waste and disease would not be truly forged for another 400 years. But the tide had begun to turn. The deep ingrained inertia, the simple centuries-old habit of tossing one's problems into the street, was finally being met with an organized systemic resistance. It was a slow, arduous and often losing battle, but it was a battle that for the first time was actually being fought. And so, as you settle deeper into your own clean, comfortable space, think of that slow, creeping change. Think of the radical novelty of a solid street underfoot, the strange community of a public latrine, the quiet dignity of the raker making his rounds at dawn. They were not building a utopia. They were just trying to make their world a little less foul, a little more orderly, one paving stone, one proclamation, one cartload of refuse at a time. They were beginning the long, slow and still unfinished process of cleaning up after ourselves, a task that began with a king holding his nose and continues with us, in our own quiet hope for a cleaner, safer world to wake up to. The monster of the miasma had not been slain, but for the first time it knew it was in a fight, and humanity, armed with paving stones and proclamations, was finally starting to push back.